looks like Endless Frontier Act is a pretty promising bill. Now, how do you think the Chinese companies should respond if it came true?
Well, I think the first thing that the Chinese companies should do is to take Dean Whelan and Judge Rader's advice. Footnote there is please tune into your earlier interview with them a few months ago. It's an excellent interview, but they make a critical point, and it's this. They can either choose to make things or innovate and make things. And if they choose to innovate and make things, it makes their interests more aligned with other countries, critically US companies. So whether a Chinese multinational company is playing or doing business in China or the US, their interests are aligned with US companies doing business in the US or in China. That way, it's easier for governments to try to apply the rules equally, whether you are a foreign company or a homegrown company. They need to realize, Chinese companies, that it's impossible to decouple the two economies. And the US too cannot just rely on its own production lines, supply chains. That's why NATO allies, that's why Southeast Asia, that's why you have India, even India is there. But the US also needs to realize that in engaging China, it cannot convert China. China has been around for a much longer period of time. It will not become like a European country. It definitely will not become like the United States of America. So Chinese companies have their own culture, but at the same time, everybody should play by the same rules on the international stage. How do you do that? Well, Chinese companies can work with the Chinese government, can work with the US government so that both sides can establish strategic trust. As I mentioned earlier, strategic trust is the key component that is missing. That is what's behind this dual circulation strategy. That's what's behind the Endless Frontier Act. How do you do that? You do that through the WTO, as many countries did before in establishing what's called the TRIPS agreement that set the minimum standards for IP protection. You can do it through the CPTPP, or RCEP, regional trade agreements with like-minded countries, but do not do it bilaterally. In the Trump administration, he tried to do it bilaterally, whether with a phase one trade agreement or with executive orders, it doesn't work. You need to bring in other countries. Businesses must be part of that so that they can trade horses. So there's more flexibility and there's less sign of concession if you give into something in order to get something else. Work on non-IP areas, non-technology areas, which are less sensitive, like climate change, public health, like the digital economy, to the extent that it doesn't focus on these strategic areas. And then over time, you build that trust.
Is there any way that Chinese companies can bypass these bills?
Yes, if you look at countries like Singapore, for example, Singapore is and markets itself as the intersection between the East and the West. It has many big Chinese companies, it has many big US companies, and they coexist in Singapore. How is it possible? Because they understand there's a rule of law that applies to all companies alike. Singapore government is not interested in favoring China or the US. It wants to be friends with both. So if you use countries like Singapore, work through Singapore, I think you can get things done if you're a Chinese company. Beyond that, I think you have to work hard to convince the Chinese government and the US government. And it certainly can be done. I don't think that they are completely oblivious to the fact that many million people in both countries depend on good decisions. And I don't think the governments in both countries want to make decisions which ultimately will leave a bad legacy for them. So sophisticated companies, I'm sure, are already working behind the scenes. But it's ultimately up to the political leadership to break free of the gravitational pull of own domestic politics, to say, I'm bigger than this. We are thinking 30 years, 50 years ahead.
What kind of companies will be affected most if these bills were passed? And which ones won't be affected or even benefit from these bills?
Well, let's start with the last one first. Which companies will benefit? Clearly, the US is aiming to benefit its own companies, the Intels of the world, chip manufacturers, but also companies that now can focus on investing in basic and advanced research, commercialization, companies that provide education, companies that help fortify the US in those 10 areas of strategic interest and technology, companies from countries that is specifically identified as being allies or partners, the NATO countries, Southeast Asian countries, India. These companies will all benefit. Which countries will not benefit? Well, if you are Iran or China, you probably won't benefit from it. But these days, it's not so easy to say that a company is a European company, a Chinese company, or US company. So what happens then? I think the government will have to find a way to act in a way that is does not end up harming its own interests. And that is not so easy to do, because even the trade war, while on the face of it seems to harm Chinese companies, but really, if you look at the figures, the US and its economy and its companies suffered a lot, which it might not have suffered had they dealt with China in a way that is a little bit more sophisticated, shall we say.